5. Her back ached badly. It had ached for a long time now, for several years, but it was getting worse, and Claire had difficulty straightening herself. She walked bent. She had gone to see a herbalist, the man who dispensed medicines to villagers, but it was clear that his remedies were the same that she had learned in her years with Alice. The drinking of birch and willow tea would ease the pain a bit, but could not take it away. Herbalist had asked her the obvious question, "What is your age?" "I don't know," she replied to him. That was true. She had been a young girl when she was washed from the sea to the place where she had lived for years. She had grown up there and become a young woman. She had left there and become overnight old. It was not a question of years. Herbalist was not surprised by her answer. Many people who had found their way to the village had little memory of their own past. He prescribed the bark infusions for her aches, but said to her, "Such pain comes for us all in great age." "I know," Claire said. She had no wish to explain what had befallen her. Herbalist lifted her arm gently and felt the thin, sagging skin. Carefully, he examined the dark spots on the backs of her hands. "Do you still have teeth?" he asked. "Some," she said, and showed him. "And your eyes, ears?" She could still see and hear. "So," Herbalist said with a smile, "you can't dance or chew meat, but if you can hear the birds sing and watch the wind and the leaves, then you still have much pleasure left. Your time is limited now, though," he told her, "so you should enjoy everything you can. That's what I do. I think I must be as old as you. I have the same aches." He wrapped the dried barks for her, and she placed them in her carrying basket. "I'll see you at the feast," he said as she turned to go. "We can watch the dancing and remember our young years. There is pleasure in that." Claire thanked him, leaned on her cane, and continued down the path to her small cottage. In the distance, she could hear some young boys shouting as they played some sort of game with the ball. Perhaps one was Gabe. She rarely found him at games, lately though. Most often he was alone in the clearing near the river, hammering away on the misshapen vessel that he called his boat. Claire often stood hidden in the trees and watched him at work. In a way, she admired his dedication to the odd project, but it saddened and puzzled her, his wish to be gone. Then, when she had entered the village for the first time, like so many others, she had been welcomed years before. The fragility of old age was new to her then, and it had still startled her when she rose in the morning with her bones aching and stiff. The memory of running, climbing, even dancing was alive and throbbing with her, but frailty made her hobble and limp. She had seen her son for the first time in this place, when he was a child of 8 or 9. She remembered that day. He ran along the path near the cottage to which she had been assigned, calling to his friends, laughing, his unkempt hair bright in the sunlight. "Gabe!" She heard a boy call, but she would have known him without hearing it. It was the same smile she remembered, the same silvery laugh. She had moved forward in that moment, intending to rush him, to greet and embrace him. Perhaps she would make the silly face, the one with which they had once mimicked each other. But when she started eagerly toward him, she forgot her own weakness. Her dragging foot caught on a stone, and she stumbled clumsily. Quickly she righted herself, but in that moment she saw him glance toward her, then look away in disinterest. As if looking through his eyes, she perceived her own withered skin, her sparse gray hair, the awkward gait with which she moved. She stayed silent and turned away, thinking. Did he need to know after all? He appeared to be a happy child. If she were to make herself known, to tell her unbelievable story, he would be stunned, uncomprehending. His friends might taunt him. Perhaps he would reject her, or worse, perhaps he would feel obligated to tend her in her remaining days. His carefree life would be interrupted. She would be a burden, an embarrassment. In the end, she decided that it was enough that she had found him. She would let him be. But she realized then the magnitude of the cruel exchange Trade Master had offered her. Through the years, she had watched Gabe grow from a mischievous boy into this quiet young man who now seemed to have a mission she didn't understand. Why a boat? The river was a dangerous thing. The village children could swim and play in the one protected section where the water was shallow and slow. But farther out and farther along, the water rushed furiously over sharp rocks. She had heard that there was a steep waterfall someplace, and fallen trees here and there that could easily smash the thin boards he was so carefully tying together with strips of bamboo. Claire was very frightened of swift-moving water. She had reason to be. She had once lived beside a river, once beside a sea. Both had brought her heartbreak and loss. She did not want her son to be lost to water. The crisp-skinned pork, sliced from the roasted pig on the spit, smelled delicious, but she knew it was not for her, not with her remaining teeth loose and her gums sore. Claire filled her plate from a large bowl of soft beans that had been baking all day in a sauce of tomatoes and herbs, and added a piece of soft bread. She would leave room, though, she thought, for a slice of blackberry pie. She set her plate on a table and eased herself onto a bench next to several others. A pregnant woman smiled at her and moved slightly, making room. Claire recognized her as Jean, the wife of one of the fiddlers who were tuning their instruments and preparing to play for the dancing. Kira was there too, keeping an eye on her toddlers as they played near the table. From time to time, she spooned food into their mouth as if they were baby birds. Eating slowly, watching the young women at the table, Claire realized that she might have been one of them. She looked down at her own gnarled hand holding a fork, an old woman's hand. Herbalist had told her she was nearing her last days, and she sensed that it was true. But inside herself, she was a young woman still, if she had not made the trade that had brought her here. Youth. In a memory, Claire could hear still how Trade Master had breathed the word into her ear, had spat against her cheek with it, how she had nodded in assent and whispered to him, Trade. She would perhaps be back with Einar now, helping him tend his lambs, cooking a stew they would share in their hillside hut, talking together by the fire in the evenings. But she would not have found her son. She would never have been Gabe again, would not have watched him grow into the lively young man he had become. She knew it was a trade she would make again, given the chance. She rose to return her emptied plate, to get herself a piece of pie, and looked over to the table where the boisterous young boys were sitting together. He was there. She saw him glance sideways at her as she passed. Then his attention returned to his plate, heaped as it was with food, and to a lengthy joke one of his friends was telling. In adolescence, Gabe was gangly and tall, and she watched, his elbow knocked over the mug holding his drink. The other boys chortled as he sheepishly mopped up the mess with his napkin. His hair was curly as hers, now a sparse bun at the back of her head, had once been. His blue eyes were surprisingly pale. Jonas had the same eyes. So did his wife, Kira. Claire remembered now that she had noticed the unusual eyes when Gabe was an infant. Those early days had come back to her very slowly, and with pain attached to each memory. The feel of the mask clamped over her face during his birth. She had shuddered when that memory returned. How, later, she had held him for the first time and had noticed the startling pale eyes. When she recalled it, she was suffused with the feeling of loss. Then she remembered the dream she had had of a hidden light-eyed baby. How in the dream she had kept him concealed in a drawer. Thinking of it after all this time, she almost wept at the sadness of all it implied. She did weep when the next memory came back, of how he had grinned and wiggled his chubby fingers at her. He had learned by then to say her name. Claire, he had said in his high voice, and bye-bye. She did not regret the trade she had made in order to find him, but she was desperately sad to realize that her time was short now. Instead of the strong and vibrant young woman she should be, the mother Gabe deserved, she was now an ancient hag waiting for death. It was a hideous joke the trade master had played on them both 7 years before. The sky darkened as night fell and the music began in earnest. Soon it would be the time for the young people, the time for dancing and flirtation. Claire saw Gabe rise from his seat and make his way over to the pretty freckle-faced girl named Deirdre. He stood self-consciously talking to her as she helped to clean the tables. She could see that Deirdre was self-conscious too, but that she purposely walked in a way that made her striped skirt twirl and flutter. Women gathered their dishes and babies in order to take them home. Claire watched Kira with the children. Annabelle was half asleep in her arms, but Matthew was dashing about wildly. Finally, Jonas scooped him up and laughed as the overtired 2-year-old kicked and cried. Together, they gathered their things and called good night, then started down the path from the pavilion toward their homes. Jonas had set Matthew on his shoulders, and the couple became silhouettes against the sky as the moon rose and Claire watched. Although Jonas had no awareness who she had once been, that once she and he had been contemporaries in the same community, Claire remembered Jonas as a boy. He was too young for fatherhood then. Nonetheless, it had been he who had saved the baby's sentence to die because the little one was eager and curious and lively. Because he didn't sleep, he was, what was the word? Disruptive. Didn't fit in. Jonas had risked his own life, sacrificed his future to bring him here. She wondered if he worried about Gabe now, about the frailty of the little boat he was striving to build and the dangers he would face if somehow he launched it into the river. When she rose from her seat in order to start down the path to her own cottage, her hip had stiffened and she stood for a moment massaging it with her hand before she was able to walk. Finally, she started down the gentle hill, carefully feeling her way in the moonlight. How soon she would be gone, Claire thought, and sighed. How little Gabe would ever know about his own past. Then she stopped suddenly and stood still. Of course, she thought, she knew what she would do. She decided she would tell her story, her own story that she had kept so secret until now, to Jonas. Someday, after she was gone, if the time was ever right, when the boy was old enough and ready, he could pass it on to her son. 6. Trademaster? Jonas looked astonished. He had listened now for a long time. He was sitting with Claire on a bench in a secluded area behind the library. She had thought about how much to tell him, and finally, 10 days after the feast, she had approached Jonas and asked if she could talk to him alone. He had brought her here late on a damp morning, carefully wiping the moisture from the bench and helping her to sit comfortably. She hadn't known exactly how to begin. Finally, she said, "I knew you when you were a boy." Jonas smiled. "I didn't realize you were here then. I thought you came to the village more recently. I would have guessed, 5 or 6 years ago, but we lose track of time, don't we?" "No," Claire said. "You're right. I arrived here close to 7 years ago, but I had known you long before then, back in the community where you had grown up." He looked more closely at her. "I'm sorry not to recognize you," he said. "I was a child there, of course. I left there after I turned 12, but I did many of my volunteer hours in the House of the Old. Were you there then? I remember a woman named... what was it? Larissa? That was it. Did you know her?" Claire shook her head. "No," she murmured. This was so hard. How could she describe to him something that would be almost impossible to believe? She sighed and kneaded her hands, which ached. It was mid-morning. Often her joints ached in the morning. She cleared her throat. Her voice, she knew, was an old person's voice now, too soft sometimes, too tentative. But she took a deep breath and tried to speak firmly, to make him listen, to make him understand the incomprehensible. My ceremony was 3 years before yours. Your ceremony? The ceremony of 12. But she held up her hand. Shh, just listen. Jonas, looking confused, fell silent. I received my assignment when I turned 12. I was assigned birth mother. She paused. That was a disappointment, of course, but I had not been a good student. She could see that he was still puzzling over her words. There was nothing to do but go on. After a while, when I was deemed ready, I moved into the birthing unit. Around them, the space of the village continued. Some women were gossiping as they weeded in the community garden. Nearby, small children played with some puppies. From Boys' Lodge, the usual group emerged and ran down the path, calling laughing insults to one another. Gabe was not among them. He had gone to his place by the river much earlier and was alone there, fitting the last parts of his odd little boat into place. All of this fell away from their awareness as Jonas and Claire sat together. She talked. He listened attentively. Now and then he interrupted her softly to ask a question. The pills. When did she stop taking the pills? I did too. I just threw them away, he told her. Did you feel the change? I felt different from the others, but I was already different in so many ways. He nodded. She could tell that he was slowly accepting the story she was telling him, but she saw him look carefully at her thin gray hair, her stooped shoulders and gnarled hands, and knew that he could not comprehend yet how she had become what she now was. She told him of her work at the fish hatchery after her discharge from the birthing center, of her search for Gabe and her visits to him. She described how the infant had begun to say her name, how he laughed at the funny face she made and tried to imitate it. Claire thrust her tongue into her cheek and made a face for Jonas. He looked startled. I remember it, he told her. When he and I were together, he stayed in my dwelling at night. I know. Sometimes he made that funny face for me, but of course I didn't know. He paused, still trying to comprehend. She continued her story. The midday bell rang. Villagers began to gather for lunch. Jonas and Claire ignored it. Will Kira be wondering where you are? He shook his head. No, she was taking the children on a picnic with some friends. Please go on, unless you're hungry. Would you like to stop for lunch? Claire said no. I don't have much of an appetite anymore. You're too thin. I eat very little. Herbalist says it's not unusual for someone my age. It's part of the natural process. Your age? Jonas asked. But you were 3 years older than I was. What happened? We'll get to that. Then you'll understand. She went on with the telling. It would take a long time. She felt that in order to understand, he must know every detail. The day cleared and a pale sun dried the moisture. By late afternoon, the shadows had lengthened and they were sitting in deep shade. The air had turned cool. Jonas had placed his jacket across Claire's shoulders. She was very tired by now, but felt oddly invigorated by relating the story to someone at last. It had been her secret, her private burden for years. She told it slowly, and he didn't hurry her. Now and then she had paused to rest. He had brought her water and a biscuit. The entire day had belonged to them and to her story. She described the torturous climb up the cliff at length, feeling the need to relieve it inch by inch, as Einar had told her he had, remembering each handhold, each precipice and narrow ledge. Talking slowly, she felt the muscles in her arms and legs respond to the memory. Jonas noticed it, how she lifted her body as in her mind she made the climb again. He winced when she told of the attack by the bird. She showed him the scar on her neck. Finally, as exhausted almost by the telling as she had been when she reached the top of the cliff that long ago dawn, she described the terrible trade she had made. Jonas leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, and put his face into his hands. Trade master, he said. I thought he was gone. We banished him from the village a long time ago. I was leader then. "Who is he?" Claire asked. He didn't respond. He stayed silent, looking now into a distant place, a place that Claire couldn't see. "I should have known," he said after a moment. "I felt something out there, something related to Gabe, but I didn't realize what it was. I think I was feeling your presence," he amused, "and that was puzzling, but benign. But there is something else, something malignant. It must be him." "Who is he?" Claire asked again. "He is evil. I don't know how else to describe it. He is evil, and like all evil, he has enormous power. He tempts, he taunts, and he takes." "Gabe has your same eyes," Claire said suddenly. "You and Gabe have the same pale eyes." "My eyes?" he said, answering her. "They see beyond the places most people can see. I'm told it's my gift, that there are others with different gifts. And yes, Gabe has the same eyes. Sometimes I wonder." From the top of a pine tree near the river, a large bird suddenly lifted itself and swooped past them in the late golden light. "Were you scared of birds at first?" Claire asked him suddenly. "What?" "When you ran away from the community, when you first saw birds, were you scared?" Jonas nodded. "Just at first, and other things too. I remember the first time I saw a fox. Gabe was so little, he wasn't afraid of anything. It was all new and exciting to him." Claire realized suddenly that he was talking to her in a different way. He had known her since she had arrived in the community, and he had always spoken to her in a kindly fashion. He had been helpful and patient, a young man to an old woman. But they had never been more than acquaintances. Now they were reminiscing together as old friends who had just reunited. "I thought of taking him," she confessed, "but I didn't know how to hide him or where I could go. And then your father showed me that he wore a special bracelet on his ankle, so I realized that he'd be caught if I tried to take him." "Yes, an electronic bracelet," Claire frowned. "I don't remember what that means, what it was. There was so much in the community that isn't part of our lives anymore, but that's what our memories consist of, small things," Jonas said. "My bicycle. I haven't seen a bicycle since then. Except the one in the museum, that was my father's bike. I stole it. It had a seat for Gabe." Claire nodded. "Yes, in my memory, I can see him riding in it. He held a toy." Jonas laughed. "His hippo. He called it Poe, didn't it? It's coming back now." "Yes, Poe." Now she could almost hear and see it, the dimpled hand clutching the stuffed toy, the high, happy voice. "Did you take the hippo with you when you escaped?" Jonas shook his head. "I couldn't. It all happened so fast. I discovered they were going to release. No, not release. They were going to kill Gabe. I took him and fled, and I had to take food. There was no room for anything else. I would have gone with you if I'd known. Things would be different now if I had." She shifted on the bench and rubbed her sore hip. "I wish," but then she fell silent. Jonas was quiet. He didn't reply. "I was so frightened of birds," she said suddenly. "Of their feathers and beaks. Then Einar brought me one, in a cage, as a pet. I named it Yellow Wing." "Einar? He was the one who—" "Yes, the one who prepared me for the climb out." Her eyes went to her feet, thick and bunioned in primitive sandals. She pulled them back beneath the bench to hide them. He knew she was remembering how limber she had been then, how balanced and sure. "I loved Einar," she told him. "Do you wish you had stayed?" Jonas asked her after a moment. "No," she said firmly, "but I wish it had not been evil that brought me here." Jonas helped her up from the bench, his hand under her arm. They had been sitting together for a long time, and Claire was stiff. She stretched slowly and took a deep breath. "Are you all right?" he asked, looking at her with concern. She nodded. "I'll be all right in a minute. My heart's fluttery sometimes, and I'm just a little slow to get moving." Jonas continued looking at her. "I remember you," he said after a moment. "We never spoke to each other," Claire pointed out. They began to walk slowly. he was seeing her home. No, but I saw you. My father mentioned you, the girl who came now and then to the nurturing center and played with Gabe. He pointed you out to me one time. I think you rode past on your bike, and he said, "That's the one." It seems so strange to realize who you are. He pointed you out to me. "That's my son," he said. He told me your name. It brings all back, those days in the community. I don't think about it anymore. I've made a life here where it's so different. So has Gabe. Jonas nodded. He doesn't remember the community. It's just as well. I'm not certain. It frustrates him not having a past or a family. So he's wondered? More than wondered, Jonas told her. He has a passionate need to figure out his past. I try to tell him what he wants to know, but it's never been enough. That's why he's building the boat. I told him we had lived by a river, perhaps this same river. He's determined to find his way back. They both fell silent. Then we must, maybe together we... They had spoken at the same time, and they were both saying the same thing. We must try to tell all of this to Gabe. Together we can help him understand. But there was not time to discuss it. They were interrupted by the shouts of boys, excited, perhaps alarmed. The noise was coming from the riverside, the place where Gabe had been working for weeks on the little boat. 7. Gabe hadn't wanted an audience for the launch. He wasn't certain the boat was completely ready, and he didn't want to be humiliated if anything went wrong. His plan was to sneak away alone. Yesterday, he had moved the boat closer to the water, shoving it across from underbrush. Now it was lying on a low, muddy section of the bank. The paddle was resting diagonally inside. The picture in his book, the book he had borrowed from Jonas, showed a lone man in the ocean, lying doomed in his small boat. His arms were taut and muscled, but useless. It was clear that the huge waves were going to be the ruin of him. He had no paddle. Gabe had thought, looking intently at the painting. Maybe he'll lose it, or maybe he forgot to bring one. There was no way the man could save himself in that overwhelming sea. He needed a paddle. For a foolish moment, Gabe focused intensely and tried to veer into the picture of the painted man, to know how it felt to be afloat, to be about to die in the sea, and to know it while safe himself, able to end the veer when he chose, just to feel the fear briefly and the movement of the churning waves. But it didn't work. The man was not real. He was the painter's idea of a man, simply daubs of paint, nothing more. A painted man who needed a paddle. Gabe was proud of the paddle he had made. He was proud of the entire boat, but he realized it was a rough, primitive construction. The paddle was different. He had felt very fortunate to have found the slender young cedar that broadened at its base, just the right potential for his plan. Carefully, he had cut the tree down and then shaped the paddle from its trunk. It seemed to take forever, but he carried it back and forth to Boy's lodge and was able to work on it in the evenings, carving carefully, smoothing, shaping. His friends, even those who ridiculed his boat, were impressed with the paddle, with its sweet, cedary smell, its graceful curved edges, and the sheen of its wood now that he had rubbed it with oil. "Can I carve my name on it? Just small, but so you can remember me?" Nathaniel had asked. Gabe had agreed, and watched while his friend carved his name meticulously. Then Simon asked, and Tariq, and others. Even those boys who had made fun of his project now took pains to add their signature. Watching them, Gabe found that he could make tiny veers into each of the boys as they bent over the paddle, carving carefully. He could feel their feelings. "I don't think he'll make it," he felt Nathaniel worrying. "He might die in the river." "I hope he finds his mother," he felt from Tariq. He wanted so badly. "He is something of a fool, but he's courageous. I'll say that for him. I wish I had his courage." Gabe was surprised to feel that from Simon, who had been scornful of the whole project. At the last, he had shyly asked Jonas to carve his name as well. He felt Jonas's fear for him, but Jonas gave no sign. His face was calm, and he smiled when he handed the paddle back with his name inscribed. He had left a rounded knob at one end for a handhold. The other end fanned out into a broad triangle. He had stood on the bank by the water and dipped in it, pulling it through to feel the river's resistance. It required strength, but Gabe was strong. In recent months, he had begun to fill out. His muscles were firm and his energy boundless. He had been delayed after lunch by some chores he had left undone. Grumpily, he folded his laundry, put it away, and straightened his room. Now, heading back to the river, he assessed the weather. The misty morning had cleared, and through the clouds a bit of sun made a narrow glint of light. The river would be smooth, Gabe thought. Sometimes after a storm it became turbulent and dangerous. He wasn't worried. His boat could manage, he was certain. But for this first test, he was glad of the calm weather. He would take it slow. He needed to learn how exactly to wield the paddle, how to steer. He flexed one arm, admired his own bicep, and wondered if Deirdre would ever notice. Then he blushed, embarrassed that he had even thought such a foolish thing. "Gabe! Hey, Gabe!" He recognized Tariq's voice, then Simon's and Nathaniel's. They had spotted him on the path. Annoyed, Gabe stopped and waited. They had guessed what he was doing. His whole group from Boys' Lodge caught up with him, just Simon and Tariq at first. Then they were joined by the others, who came running. "You going to do it, Gabe? Put it in the water? Can we watch?" "We'll be your rescuers," Tariq suggested. He had wanted to be alone for this. Too late now. Well, let them watch. When the time came, the real time, the time when he would leave for good, he would do it alone. Maybe at night, he'd leave a note at Boys' Lodge, a separate note for Jonas, he thought, with a thank you. Jonas had done his best for Gabe. Deirdre? No, that would be foolish. No note for Deirdre. Let her wonder about him always. For now, though, no notes. This was just a practice. What was it they called it in that book about boats? A sea trial. That's what it would be. "Hey, Gabe." Simon saw the coiled rope beside his little shed. Gabe had tied stacks of boards together in order to drag them into place. He planned to return the rope soon. "What? How about if you tie one end of this rope to the boat and we'll hold the other end when you push off? Then if you have any kind of trouble, we can haul you back in." Gabe scowled at Simon. "Like a baby with a toy boat in the pond?" "No, I meant—" "Forget it, Simon. Leave the rope where it is. I borrowed it from Jonas. He wants it back. Anybody who wants to help, give me a hand pushing it into the water." Several of the boys came eagerly to the bank where the boat was wedged in the slick mud. "But listen, Gabe," Nathaniel sounded worried. "Maybe you should at least take the rope with you in the boat, because when you want to come ashore, you'll need to grab something. Maybe you could make a noose in the rope and throw it over to a tree stump or a bush." "Yes, he's right, Gabe," someone else said. Gabe stood beside his boat, furious. They were ruining everything, crowding around, criticizing, predicting disaster. "Look there, where these two boards don't quite come together," a boy named Stefan said suddenly. "Want water coming through that crack?" he pointed. Gabe glanced to where Stefan was pointing. He had meant to fill that wide crack with thick mud and let it dry and harden. "When the boards get wet," he said, "they'll expand and come together there." Stefan looked skeptical. "But what if—" "Look," Gabe said impatiently, "if you're going to be all worried about it, I'll stuff something in the gap. Hand me that rack." He gestured toward the piece of cloth he had used to oil the paddle. It was lying near the shed. Stefan tossed it to him, and Gabe ripped it into strips. Then he stuffed one wetty strip of cloth into the space between the boards. "There," he said. "Happy?" Stefan glanced nervously at the others standing on the bank. Simon shrugged. Nathaniel looked very worried. Tariq grinned. "Sure," he said. "Happy." "Happy to see you sink," muttered one boy, and several others laughed. Gabe ignored them now. He was concentrating on moving the boat into the water from its muddy resting place. His hands were slippery on the rounded wood. He leaned his shoulder against it and pushed. Several of the boys were pushing as well. And with the sudden lurch, the bottom of the boat lifted from the mud and moved forward into the water. Gabe leaped in, tumbling onto his backside, and grabbed the paddle. The river water was very still here at the shallow edge. Gabe raised himself first to his knees. Then he stood upright, holding the paddle against the wooden floor of the boat for balance. He hadn't anticipated that it would rock and tip the way it was, but he spread his bare feet for balance. He was still quite near the shore, and he forgot his anger and impatience in the triumph of the moment when he was finally standing upright without faltering. In a moment, he would kneel and begin to steer with the paddle. But for now, it seemed appropriate to stand tall, to raise one hand from the paddle and salute his friends, who were watching apprehensively. They grinned. Then, to his surprise, the boat began to rotate. Now he was no longer facing the shore and his friends. He was looking out toward the center of the river and across to the trees on the opposite bank. Well, of course, he thought, realizing that he wasn't steering it yet. He knelt, balancing awkwardly. He raised the paddle and dipped it into the water. He had practiced this, pulling the water with the broadened end, and he knew how it felt, so the resistance didn't surprise him. Leaning forward, he pulled the paddle against the current, and the boat responded slightly, revolving a bit. So then again, he saw the boys, but they were farther from him now. The river was drawing him outward, away from the bank. He had planned this. This was his time to practice controlling the boat, propelling and steering it. With the paddle, he moved it slightly toward the bank he had just left, but the river pulled him farther out again. All right, he thought. I need to steer faster. He took several long pulls with the paddle and brought himself again closer to shore, but he was moving with the current down the river, and a group of young elders were hiding the boys from him now. He realized it would be hard to get back to them. The current was pulling him away from where they stood. Are you all right? He recognized Nathaniel's voice. Yes, he called back. I'm just figuring out how the paddle works. The boat spun slightly and tilted. It was hard for him to regain his balance. He planted his knees and feet. He realized suddenly that they were wet, not from the damp mud of the riverbank, but from the water that was streaming in through cracks between the boards. He tried to aim for shore, pulling through the water with his paddle, but the boat felt heavier now, with water in it. He could hear the boys' voices, shouting, getting closer to him. He realized that his friends were running along the riverbank, following him as he moved, the boat rolling clumsily out of control. The water had risen and covered his lower legs. The paddle seemed more and more useless as a steering device. Finally, angrily, he plunged it straight downward through the water and felt it scrape the bottom. It slowed the boat. Through the bushes, the boys appeared, calling to him. Here! Tariq shouted. I brought the rope. If I throw it to you, we can pull you to shore. Gabe knew what he wanted to call back. He wanted to call, Don't bother. I can paddle myself to shore. But it wasn't true. The paddle was stuck in the muddy bottom of the river, and it was, at the moment, precariously holding the boat still. But the swirling water was rising. All right, throw it. At least he caught the rope on the first throw, so he wasn't additionally humiliated. He wrapped it around his wrist and waited until Tariq had found a firm footing on the riverbank. Two other boys reached for the rope as well, and when Gabe called, Now! They pulled as he lifted the paddle that had held him still. The boat swayed and the water sloshed around his lower body. Gradually, it moved to shore. When he looked up at the bottom of the boat scraped against the rocks at the shallow edge, he saw Jonas there as well, looking concerned. It needs work, he muttered as he climbed out. He tied one end of the rope to the boat, threading it through a gap between some boards near the top. He took the other end from Tariq and looked around for a tree trunk to tie it to. Boys, he heard Jonas say. It's time to start getting ready for supper. You go on. I'll stay here with Gabe. Thanks for your help. Gabe knotted the rope around the slender trunk of a nearby sapling and glanced back at the small leaky failure of a boat that he had been so proud of a short time before. It was smeared with mud, and the torn rag was dangling from the gap he had stuffed it into. Jonas was waiting for him, standing slightly, his expression sympathetic. I don't know why I'm tying it up. I should just let it float out there and sink. Gabe's voice was shaking with tears very near the surface. He wiped his wet, dirt-smeared hands on his dripping shorts and climbed the bank to face the man who was the closer thing he had to a father. I'm sorry, Jonas said. It's not even a real boat. It's just a bunch of boards tied together. That's all it is. He wiped his face with one dirty hand and looked angrily at Jonas, defying him to disagree. It floated, though, he added. Yes, it did float. And my paddle really worked well. All that work, the weeks and weeks of planning, of building, of hoping. And all he could say now was that the paddle worked well. Gabe felt it all slipping away. His dream of returning, of finding his mother, of becoming part of something he had yearned for all his life. He had envisioned a triumphant return to the place where his life had begun. He had daydreamed about being recognized and greeted. Look, it's Gabriel. In his imagination, he had seen his mother running, her arms outstretched to enfold him as he stepped smiling from his sturdy little vessel. The river still surged past. It moved and churned, foaming and dark, carrying leaves and sand and twigs from one place to the next. What a fool he had been, to think that it could have carried him as well. Angrily, he kicked at the boat, then turned away. Come with me, Gabe. You can come back to my house and get cleaned up there. Kira will give us some supper and we can talk. There's something important I need to tell you. Gabe scowled at his ruined boat one more time. Then, grudgingly, he climbed the slippery bank, carrying his paddle. He followed Jonas to the path that led back to the village.